In the shadowed halls of Ravenswood Palace, where crown jewels catch moonlight through ancient stained glass windows, some secrets are worth killing for. Captain Elena Hartwell thought she knew every corner of the royal residence after 15 years of faithful service. She was wrong. Behind a loose stone in the castle's forgotten archives lay documents that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy and reveal why Queen Consort Camilla Ashford had spent decades orchestrating the downfall of the beloved late Queen Diana Rosewood. What Elena discovered that stormy October night would transform her from loyal protector into an instrument of long-overdue justice, setting in motion events that would either restore honor to a fallen queen's memory or destroy the royal family forever. The rain hammered against the mullioned windows of Ravenswood Palace with an intensity that seemed almost personal, as if the very heavens were angry with the ancient stone fortress that had housed the royal family for over 4 centuries. Captain Elena Hartwell pulled her midnight blue uniform jacket tighter around her shoulders as she made her final rounds of the evening, her polished boots echoing through corridors lined with portraits of long-dead monarchs, whose painted eyes seemed to follow her movement through the gloom. At 38, Elena had dedicated more than half her adult life to protecting the royal family, rising through the ranks from a young recruit fresh out of the Royal Military Academy to the first female captain of the Palace Guard. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her sharp green eyes missed nothing as they swept the familiar halls she'd walked thousands of times before. Tonight, however, something felt different. There was a tension in the air that went beyond the usual pre-anniversary melancholy that settled over the palace each October. Tomorrow would mark the 10th anniversary of Queen Diana Rosewood's tragic death in a car accident in Paris, a loss that had plunged the nation into mourning and left King William Ashford a broken man for nearly 2 years. The official story was well known to every citizen of the realm. Diana, beloved by the people for her charitable work and genuine warmth, had been traveling to a private charity event when her vehicle skidded on wet roads and crashed into a bridge support. She died instantly, the coroner had reported, sparing her any suffering. Elena remembered that night vividly. She had been a junior guard then, stationed at the palace's main entrance when the call came through. The wailing of sirens, the flashing lights of emergency vehicles, and the terrible silence that followed had haunted her dreams for months. King William had been inconsolable, refusing to eat or sleep for days, while the nation mourned the loss of their people's princess, as Diana had been affectionately known. 2 years after Diana's death, William had remarried Camilla Ashford, his former private secretary and longtime confidant. The marriage had been met with mixed reactions from the public, many of whom felt it was too soon and that Camilla could never fill Diana's shoes. But Camilla had gradually won over most critics with her quiet dignity and unwavering support of the grieving king. She had been instrumental in helping William return to his royal duties and had even established several charitable foundations in Diana's memory. Now, as Elena walked through the East Wing toward the rarely used archive chambers, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Earlier that evening, she had overheard a heated conversation between Queen Consort Camilla and her private secretary, Lord Marcus Pemberton. The words had been muffled, but Elena had distinctly heard Diana's name mentioned several times, along with phrases like buried secrets and anniversary problems. The archive chambers were housed in the oldest part of the palace, dating back to the 14th century when the first King Ashford had established his seat of power. The rooms were filled with centuries of royal correspondence, historical documents, and official records that few people ever bothered to examine. Most of the guards considered the archives a dead assignment, but Elena had always been fascinated by history and often volunteered for archive duty when she needed to think. As she approached the heavy oak door marked with the royal seal, Elena noticed that it was slightly ajar. Protocol dictated that all archive rooms should be sealed and locked after hours, accessible only to senior historians and members of the royal family with special permission. Her hand instinctively moved to the radio clipped to her shoulder, but something made her hesitate. Instead of calling for backup, she decided to investigate quietly. The door creaked on its ancient hinges as Elena pushed it open, revealing rows upon rows of wooden filing cabinets and document boxes stretching back into the shadows. Emergency lighting cast an eerie glow over everything, creating dancing shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The air smelled of old parchment, leather bindings, and the faint mustiness that came with age. Elena moved carefully between the rows, her hand resting on the grip of her service pistol as she strained to listen for any sound that might indicate an intruder's presence. The silence was almost complete, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and the steady drumming of rain against the windows high above. She was beginning to think that perhaps maintenance had simply forgotten to secure the door when she heard a soft scraping sound from the far end of the archives. Moving with the stealth that had been drilled into her during years of training, Elena crept toward the source of the noise. As she rounded a corner formed by two tall filing cabinets, she saw a figure hunched over an open document box, frantically shuffling through papers by the light of a small flashlight. The person was wearing dark clothing and a hood that obscured their features, but their movements suggested urgency and desperation. Elena was about to announce her presence when the intruder straightened up with an exclamation of triumph, holding a manila folder in their gloved hands. In that moment, the hood fell back, revealing the aristocratic features of Lord Marcus Pemberton, Queen Consort Camilla's most trusted advisor. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she watched the elderly man open the folder and examine its contents with obvious satisfaction. "Perfect," Pemberton whispered to himself, his cultured voice carrying clearly in the silence. "After all these years, still exactly where she left them. Camilla will be so pleased that the final loose ends can be tied up before tomorrow's anniversary ceremonies." Elena's mind raced as she tried to process what she was witnessing. Why would Pemberton be secretly searching through the archives? What documents could be so important that the Queen Consort's private secretary would risk breaking into restricted areas to retrieve them? And what did any of this have to do with Diana's anniversary? As Pemberton began to close the folder and prepare to leave, Elena made a decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting him immediately, she decided to wait and see what he would do with the documents. She pressed herself against the shadows behind a large filing cabinet as Pemberton made his way toward the exit, moving with surprising agility for a man in his 70s. Once she was sure he had left the archives, Elena hurried to the document box that Pemberton had been searching through. The box was labeled Personal Correspondence, Queen Diana Rosewood 1998-2003 in faded ink, and it was clear that several folders were missing from what should have been a complete collection. Elena's heart began to pound as the implications of what she had witnessed started to sink in. Using her own flashlight, Elena examined the remaining contents of the box. Most of it appeared to be routine correspondence between Diana and various charitable organizations, along with personal letters from friends and family members. But as Elena dug deeper, she found something that made her blood run cold. A series of letters bearing the official seal of a private investigative firm in London, all addressed to Queen Diana and dated just weeks before her death. The letters referenced a confidential investigation and mentioned conclusive evidence of some unspecified wrongdoing. One letter, dated just 5 days before Diana's fatal accident, contained a single chilling line. "Your Majesty, the evidence we have gathered regarding the conspiracy against you is more extensive than we initially believed. We strongly recommend that you take immediate precautions for your personal safety while we prepare our final report." Elena's hands trembled as she read the words again, trying to convince herself that she was misunderstanding their meaning. But the implications were clear. Someone had been investigating a conspiracy against Diana, and Diana had known about it before her death. The question that now burned in Elena's mind was whether that conspiracy had been successful in silencing the beloved queen before she could expose whatever secret she had uncovered. As thunder crashed overhead and lightning illuminated the archive chamber in brief, stark flashes, Elena carefully photographed the remaining documents with her phone before replacing them in the box exactly as she had found them. She had a terrible feeling that she had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than a simple security breach, something that could threaten not just her own life, but the very stability of the monarchy itself. The walk back to the security office felt like the longest journey of Elena's life. Her mind buzzed with questions and possibilities, each more frightening than the last. If Diana had been murdered to prevent her from exposing some conspiracy, who had been responsible? And what role, if any, had Camilla played in the events that led to Diana's death? As Elena sat at her desk in the quiet security office, staring at the photograph she had taken of the investigative letters, she realized that she was faced with an impossible choice. She could report what she had seen to her superiors and risk being dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, Or she could investigate further on her own and risk uncovering truths that powerful people had killed to keep hidden. The rain continued to pound against the windows as Elena weighed her options, unaware that her decision to photograph those documents had already set in motion a chain of events that would shake the royal family to its very core. In choosing to seek the truth about Diana's death, she had unknowingly become the instrument of a revenge that had been 10 years in the making, orchestrated by forces beyond her understanding, but guided by a justice that would not be denied. As the clock in the security office chimed midnight, marking the official beginning of Diana's death anniversary, Elena made her choice. She would discover the truth, no matter the cost. What she didn't know was that the truth she sought would prove to be more shocking and dangerous than anything she could have imagined, and that by morning, her life would be forever changed. The ghost of Queen Diana Rosewood, it seemed, was finally ready to have her revenge. Part 2. Dawn broke gray and sullen over Ravenswood Palace, the autumn sky still heavy with the promise of more rain. Elena Hartwell had not slept a single hour since discovering the mysterious documents in the archives. She sat in her small apartment in the palace's staff quarters, surrounded by printed copies of the photographs she had taken, trying to piece together a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with each passing moment. The investigative letters she had found were signed by Detective Inspector James Morrison of Morrison Private Investigations, a firm that specialized in high-profile cases involving political figures and celebrities. Elena had spent the early morning hours researching the company online, learning that Morrison had built a reputation as one of London's most discreet and thorough private investigators. What troubled Elena most was that Morrison Private Investigations had closed permanently just 2 weeks after Diana's death, with no explanation given to clients or the public. Elena's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from her former military contact, Sarah Chen, who now worked in intelligence. Elena had reached out to Sarah in the pre-dawn hours, asking for help tracking down any information about Detective Inspector Morrison without revealing the full scope of what she had discovered. The message was brief but chilling. Morrison died in apparent suicide 3 days after Diana's accident. Case closed without investigation. Official cause, depression over failed case. Unofficial whispers suggest otherwise. Be careful, Elena. The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. If Morrison had killed himself just days after Diana's death, it could hardly be coincidence. More likely, he had been silenced before he could reveal whatever evidence he had gathered about the conspiracy against the late Queen. Elena realized she might be the only person alive who knew that Diana had been investigating threats against her own life in the final weeks before her death. A soft knock at her apartment door made Elena's heart race. She quickly gathered the documents and photographs, stuffing them into a secure folder before checking her appearance in the mirror. Her reflection showed a woman who looked like she had aged years in a single night, with dark circles under her green eyes and stress lines around her mouth that hadn't been there yesterday. Captain Hartwell? The voice belonged to Lieutenant James Wright, one of her most trusted subordinates. I'm sorry to disturb you so early, ma'am, but Queen Consort Camilla has requested your immediate presence in the blue drawing room. She said it was a matter of urgent security. Elena's blood turned to ice. Could Camilla somehow know what she had discovered? Had Lord Pemberton realized that someone had witnessed his midnight expedition to the archives? Elena forced her voice to remain steady as she replied, "Thank you, Lieutenant. Please inform Her Majesty that I'll be there in 10 minutes. As Wright's footsteps receded down the corridor, Elena made a quick decision. She activated a secure cloud backup on her phone, uploading all the photographs and documents to an encrypted server that only she could access. If something happened to her, the evidence would not die with her. She then locked the physical documents in her personal safe, said a brief prayer to whatever gods might be watching over her, and set out for what could be the most dangerous meeting of her life. The blue drawing room was one of the palace's most elegant reception chambers, decorated in shades of royal blue and gold that had been unchanged since the reign of King Charles III 2 centuries earlier. Morning light filtered through tall windows, casting intricate patterns on the Persian rugs and illuminating the oil paintings of former monarchs that watched over the room with stern, painted eyes. Queen Consort Camilla stood with her back to the door, gazing out at the formal gardens where groundskeepers were already at work preparing for the day's anniversary ceremonies. At 55, Camilla retained the understated elegance that had first caught King William's attention when she served as his private secretary. Her silver blonde hair was perfectly styled, and she wore a simple black dress that managed to convey both mourning for Diana and regal authority. "Captain Hartwell," Camilla said without turning around, her voice carrying the refined accent of the aristocracy. "Thank you for coming so promptly. Please, close the door behind you and ensure that we are not disturbed." Elena did as instructed, her hand trembling slightly as she turned the antique key in the lock. When she faced the room again, Camilla had turned and was studying her with intelligent blue eyes that seemed to see everything. For a moment, neither woman spoke, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. "I understand you were working late last night," Camilla finally said, moving to pour herself a cup of tea from an elegant service set on a side table. "Lord Pemberton mentioned that he thought he saw a security officer near the archives around midnight. I do hope everything was in order." The question seemed innocent enough, but Elena could hear the steel underneath Camilla's polite tone. She chose her words carefully, aware that her life might depend on how well she played this dangerous game. "Everything appeared to be secure, Your Majesty. I conduct random security sweeps of all areas of the palace as part of my duties. I found nothing unusual." Camilla nodded slowly, sipping her tea with practiced grace. "How fortunate. The archives contain so many sensitive historical documents. It would be terrible if anything were to go missing, especially on such a significant anniversary." She set down her teacup and moved closer to Elena, her eyes never leaving the captain's face. "You know, Elena, may I call you Elena? You remind me of someone I once knew. Someone who was very curious about things that didn't concern her." Elena's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact. "I'm not sure I understand, Your Majesty." "Diana?" Camilla said simply, the name dropping into the silence like a stone into still water. "Queen Diana was always so curious, always asking questions, always looking for conspiracies where none existed. It was one of her less admirable qualities, though the public never saw that side of her personality." The contempt in Camilla's voice was subtle but unmistakable, and Elena realized that she was seeing the real woman behind the carefully constructed public persona. This was not the grieving stepmother who had honored Diana's memory with charitable foundations and memorial services. This was someone who had genuinely despised the late queen and felt no remorse about her death. "Of course," Camilla continued, moving to examine a portrait of King William's grandfather, "Diana's curiosity ultimately proved to be her undoing. She became convinced that there were people plotting against her, that her marriage to William was somehow under threat. She even hired private investigators to look into matters that should have remained private. Can you imagine anything so paranoid?" Elena's heart pounded so hard she was certain Camilla must be able to hear it. The queen consort was essentially confessing to knowledge of Diana's investigation, and her casual tone suggested that she felt completely secure in revealing these details. Either Camilla was supremely confident that Elena would never repeat what she was hearing, or she had no intention of allowing Elena to leave this room alive. "I'm sure Queen Diana was only trying to protect her family," Elena managed to say, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. Camilla laughed, a sound like silver bells that somehow managed to be completely devoid of warmth. "Protect her family? My dear Elena, Diana was the greatest threat her family ever faced. She was reckless, impulsive, and far too willing to air the royal family's private business in public. Her charitable work made her popular with the masses, but she had no understanding of discretion or the delicate balance required to maintain the monarchy's reputation." The queen consort moved to another painting, this one depicting a medieval battle scene where armored knights clashed on a field of blood and mud. "Sometimes," she said thoughtfully, "the greatest act of loyalty is to remove a threat before it can do irreparable damage. Sometimes the people we love most must be protected from their own poor judgment." Elena felt as if the room was spinning around her. Camilla was no longer being subtle about her meaning. She was essentially admitting that Diana had been murdered to protect the royal family from some unspecified threat that the late queen had posed. The casual way she spoke about it suggested that she felt completely justified in whatever role she had played in Diana's death. "I'm curious, Elena," Camilla said, turning back to face her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What would you do if you discovered that someone was threatening the stability of the monarchy? If you learned that a member of the royal family was planning to reveal secrets that could destroy the institution you've sworn to protect?" The question hung in the air between them, and Elena realized that she was being tested. Camilla was trying to determine whether Elena could be trusted with the knowledge she had already revealed, or whether she represented the same kind of threat that Diana had apparently posed 10 years earlier. Elena's mind raced as she tried to formulate a response that might keep her alive while not completely compromising her principles. "I suppose," she said carefully, "that my duty would be to report any such threat to the proper authorities and allow them to handle the situation according to law." Camilia's smile widened, but her eyes remained cold and calculating. "How wonderfully naive. Tell me, Elena, do you really believe that the proper authorities would handle such a delicate situation with the discretion required? Do you think they would understand the broader implications of allowing royal secrets to become public knowledge?" Before Elena could respond, Camilla moved to her purse and withdrew a small digital device that looked like a smartphone but had several additional buttons and antennas. "This is a very sophisticated piece of technology," she explained, holding the device up for Elena to see. "It can detect electronic signals from quite a distance, including the kind of signals generated when someone takes unauthorized photographs with their phone." Elena's blood turned to ice as she realized the implications of what Camilla was saying. The device must have detected the photographs Elena had taken in the archives the previous night. Somehow, Camilla had known about Elena's discovery from the very beginning. "You see," Camilla continued in the same conversational tone, "I've learned that it's always better to stay ahead of potential problems rather than wait for them to develop into actual threats. That's a lesson I learned from watching Diana's mistakes. She was always reactive, always responding to crises instead of preventing them." The queen consort moved closer to Elena, and for the first time, the captain could see something dangerous flickering in those intelligent blue eyes. "The question now," Camilla said softly, "is whether you're going to prove to be as foolish and reckless as Diana was, or whether you're intelligent enough to understand where your true loyalties should lie." Elena realized that she was at a crossroads that would determine not just her own fate, but possibly the future of the monarchy itself. The woman standing before her had essentially confessed to involvement in the murder of Queen Diana, and now she was offering Elena the choice between complicity and death. As thunder rumbled overhead and the first drops of a new storm began to spatter against the windows, Elena knew that whatever decision she made in the next few moments would echo through history. Diana's ghost was watching from beyond the grave, waiting to see if justice would finally be served, or if another loyal servant would be silenced to protect the terrible secrets that had led to a beloved queen's death. The game of royal revenge was far from over, and Elena Hartwell had just become its most important player. Part 3. The tension in the blue drawing room was suffocating as Elena stared into Queen Consort Camilla's calculating blue eyes. Every instinct Elena had developed during her 15 years of military and security service screamed at her to run, to fight, to do anything except stand there like a trapped animal waiting for the inevitable. But she also knew that this moment represented more than just her own survival. The truth about Diana's death hung in the balance, and Elena might be the only person left alive who could expose the conspiracy that had claimed the life of the people's beloved queen. "I can see you're thinking very hard about your response," Camilla observed, returning to her tea service with the casual demeanor of someone discussing the weather. "That's good. It shows you understand the gravity of the situation. Diana never was much of a thinker, I'm afraid. She was all emotion and impulse, which made her both charming to the public and extremely dangerous to those of us who understood what was really at stake." Elena forced herself to speak, knowing that silence would be interpreted as weakness. "What was at stake, Your Majesty? What could Diana have possibly done that justified—" She let the sentence hang unfinished, unwilling to speak the word murder aloud in case it triggered a violent response. Camilla's laugh was like crystal breaking. "Oh, my dear, you still think this was about personal jealousy or romantic rivalry, don't you? How delightfully simple that would have been." She moved to an ornate mahogany desk and withdrew a thick manila folder, placing it on the coffee table between them. "The truth is so much more complex and far more damaging to the crown than a mere love triangle ever could have been." With trembling hands, Elena watched as Camilla opened the folder to reveal photographs, documents, and what appeared to be bank records. The first photograph made Elena's breath catch in her throat. It showed King William in what was clearly a private meeting with a man Elena didn't recognize, but whose face had the hard, calculating look of someone accustomed to violence. Allow me to educate you about the realities of maintaining a monarchy in the modern world, Camilla said, her voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a lecture. Do you really believe that royal families maintain their power and wealth through ceremony and public appearances alone? The British royal fortune isn't built on tourism revenue and government allowances, my dear. There are investments, business partnerships, and occasionally arrangements that require a certain level of discretion. Elena studied the photographs as Camilla continued speaking. There were images of King William meeting with various individuals in locations that clearly weren't official royal residences. Some of the men in the photos wore expensive suits and had the bearing of successful businessmen, while others looked like they belonged in back alleys rather than palace drawing rooms. William's father left behind significant debts when he died, Camilla explained, settling into an antique chair across from Elena. Not just financial debts, but obligations to certain organizations that had helped the royal family weather previous storms. When William inherited the throne, he also inherited those relationships and the necessity of maintaining them. The implications of what Camilla was suggesting began to dawn on Elena as she examined more of the photographs. You're saying the royal family has connections to criminal organizations? Such an ugly term, Camilla replied with distaste. I prefer to think of them as alternative business partners. These relationships have existed for decades, Elena. They've helped the royal family navigate difficult political situations, manage public relations crises, and maintain the kind of financial stability that allows us to continue our charitable work and public service. Elena felt sick as she began to understand the scope of what she was learning. And Diana discovered these connections? Camilla's expression darkened with what appeared to be genuine anger. Diana was supposed to be a decorative princess who smiled at charity events and produced the requisite heirs. Instead, she became obsessed with reforming the monarchy from within. She started asking questions about royal finances, demanding to see accounting records, and threatening to make certain information public if William didn't come clean about what she called the family's corrupt associations. The queen consort stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the formal gardens where workers were setting up memorial displays for the day's anniversary ceremonies. Diana hired that private investigator, Morrison, to gather evidence about William's business relationships. She was planning to present everything to Parliament and the press immediately after the anniversary of her wedding to William. She actually believed she could expose these arrangements and somehow maintain the integrity of the monarchy. Elena's mind reeled as she processed the information. Diana hadn't been investigating a conspiracy against herself. She had been investigating the royal family's connections to organized crime and planning to expose them publicly. In trying to reform the monarchy from corruption, she had signed her own death warrant. Morrison was surprisingly thorough, Camilla continued, her voice taking on an admiring tone. He managed to document decades of financial arrangements, photograph secret meetings, and even record several conversations between William and various business associates. Diana had enough evidence to destroy the royal family completely. So you had them both killed, Elena said quietly, the words coming out before she could stop herself. Camilla turned from the window with raised eyebrows. Killed? My dear Elena, you have such a melodramatic way of viewing things. Diana died in a tragic accident, and Morrison took his own life due to depression over his failure to protect his client. These are simply unfortunate coincidences. But Elena could see the truth in Camilla's eyes, and she realized that the queen consort was enjoying this conversation far too much to be completely innocent. You orchestrated everything. The accident, Morrison's suicide, probably even the closing of his investigative firm. I coordinated damage control, Camilla corrected with a slight smile. When it became clear that Diana's reckless crusade would destroy not just William but the entire royal institution, I took steps to protect what really mattered. The monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years, Elena. It will not fall because one naive princess couldn't understand the complexity of real power. Elena felt a cold rage building in her chest as she stared at this woman who spoke so casually about murder and conspiracy. Diana was trying to do the right thing. She was trying to clean up the corruption and restore honor to the crown. Diana was a fool who would have destroyed everything good about the royal family in service of her own moral grandstanding. Camilla snapped, her composed facade cracking for the first time. Do you have any idea how many people depend on the monarchy for their livelihoods? How many charitable organizations would collapse if royal funding disappeared? How much economic damage would be done if the royal family were exposed as criminals and the entire institution were abolished? The queen consort moved closer to Elena, and for the first time, Elena could see the full extent of the ruthlessness that lay beneath Camilla's polite exterior. I saved the monarchy from Diana's idealism, just as I'm prepared to save it from anyone else who threatens its stability. The arrangements William inherited may not be conventional, but they've allowed us to fund hospitals, support research foundations, and maintain the kind of diplomatic relationships that prevent wars and save lives. Elena realized she was listening to a woman who had convinced herself that murder was justifiable in service of a greater good. Camilla genuinely believed that she had been acting as a protector of the crown and the nation, even as she orchestrated the death of a woman whose only crime had been wanting to expose corruption. "What about justice for Diana?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Camilla's smile returned, cold and calculating. Justice was served when the greatest threat to the monarchy was eliminated. Diana's death allowed William to continue his father's work, maintain crucial relationships, and preserve an institution that has been the cornerstone of British society for centuries. She paused, studying Elena's face carefully. "The question now is whether you understand the importance of preserving that legacy, or whether you're going to make the same mistakes Diana made." Elena realized that she was being offered the same choice Diana had faced: remain silent about the royal family's corruption, or face the consequences of opposing Camilla's version of loyalty. The difference was that Elena now knew what those consequences could be, and she had to decide whether the truth was worth risking her life to expose. As she stared into Camilla's cold blue eyes, Elena thought about Diana's final weeks, knowing that powerful people wanted her dead and having nowhere to turn for help. The beloved princess had died alone, betrayed by the very family she had tried to save from itself. But unlike Diana, Elena was not alone. She had allies, training, and most importantly, evidence that could finally bring justice to a woman who had been murdered for trying to do what was right. The ghost of Queen Diana seemed to whisper in Elena's ear as she made her decision. Some things were worth dying for, and the truth was definitely one of them. "I understand perfectly," Elena said, meeting Camilla's gaze steadily. "I understand that you're a murderer who's convinced herself she's a patriot. I understand that you killed Diana to protect corruption, instead of supporting her efforts to restore honor to the crown. And I understand that you're threatening to kill me because you're terrified that the truth will finally come out." Camilla's smile vanished, replaced by an expression of genuine surprise. "How disappointing. I had hoped you would be more intelligent than Diana proved to be." Elena stood slowly, her hand moving subtly toward her service weapon. Diana wasn't unintelligent. She was brave. She was willing to sacrifice her own safety to protect an institution she loved from people like you who had corrupted it beyond recognition. The two women stared at each other across the elegant drawing room, and Elena could practically feel the weight of history pressing down on both of them. In the next few moments, the truth about Diana's death would either finally see the light of day, or another loyal servant would join the conspiracy of silence that had protected royal corruption for decades. As thunder crashed outside the palace walls, Elena prepared for the fight of her life, knowing that Diana's ghost was finally ready to claim her long-delayed revenge. Part 4. The silence in the blue drawing room stretched between Elena and Queen Consort Camilla like a razor wire. Both women perfectly aware that the next few moments would determine not just their individual fates, but the future of the British monarchy itself. Elena's hand hovered near her service weapon, while Camilla maintained her elegant composure despite the fury Elena could see building behind her calculating blue eyes. "You know," Camilla said conversationally, moving with deliberate slowness toward her purse, "Diana said almost exactly the same thing during our final conversation. She was so convinced of her own moral superiority, so certain that her version of truth was more important than the stability of the crown." Her hand disappeared into the designer bag, and Elena tensed, ready to draw her weapon at the first sign of a threat. But instead of a gun, Camilla withdrew her phone and activated what appeared to be a recording application. "I want you to hear something, Elena. I want you to understand exactly what kind of woman you're choosing to champion." Diana's voice filled the room, tinny and distant through the phone speakers, but unmistakably belonging to the late queen. Elena's breath caught as she realized she was listening to a recording of Diana's final conversation with her killer. "You don't understand, Camilla," Diana's recorded voice pleaded. "I'm not trying to destroy William or the monarchy. I'm trying to save them. These criminal connections will eventually be exposed with or without my involvement. At least if we come forward voluntarily, we can control the narrative and show that the royal family is committed to transparency and reform." Camilla's recorded voice responded with the same cold politeness Elena had been hearing all morning. "My dear Diana, you're being incredibly naive. These relationships have protected the royal family for decades. They prevented scandals, eliminated threats, and ensured that we have the resources necessary to maintain our position. Destroying them in the name of some abstract moral principle would be catastrophically irresponsible." Elena listened in horrified fascination as the conversation continued, with Diana becoming increasingly desperate and Camilla remaining icily calm. It was clear that this meeting had taken place shortly before Diana's death, and that Diana had been making one final attempt to convince her husband's closest advisor to support her planned revelations. "I have enough evidence to bring down everyone involved," Diana's voice continued, now edged with steel. "Morrison has documented everything: the money laundering, the protected witness intimidation, the political assassination contracts. If you don't help me convince William to come clean, I'll have no choice but to present everything to Parliament and the press myself, and destroy your own children's inheritance in the process." Camilla's recorded voice remained perfectly controlled. William Jr. and Prince Henry would lose everything: their titles, their security, their future. The monarchy itself might not survive the scandal. Is your conscience really worth that much destruction? There was a long pause in the recording, and Elena could hear Diana crying softly. When the late queen spoke again, her voice was broken but determined. "My children will be proud to know that their mother chose to do what was right, even when it was difficult. I can't let this corruption continue in their name. I won't let them inherit a crown that's been built on blood and criminal money." The recording ended, and Camilla looked at Elena with an expression of smug satisfaction. "You see? Diana was perfectly willing to destroy her own family for the sake of her moral crusade. She would have brought down the entire monarchy, left thousands of people unemployed, and destabilized the government, all to satisfy her own need to feel righteous." Elena stared at Camilla in absolute disgust. She was trying to save her children from inheriting a legacy of corruption. She was trying to ensure that the crown they eventually wore would actually mean something instead of being a symbol of organized crime. "Symbols only have meaning if the institution they represent continues to exist," Camilla replied sharply. "Diana's revelations would have ended the monarchy forever. At least now, William Jr. will inherit a throne that still commands respect, even if that respect requires certain compromises to maintain." Elena realized that she was looking at a woman who had become so corrupted by power that she genuinely believed murder was preferable to moral reform. Camilla had convinced herself that she was protecting the monarchy from Diana's idealism, when in reality she had been protecting her own position within a criminal enterprise that had infected the royal family like a cancer. "How did you do it?" Elena asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "How did you arrange Diana's death?" Camilla's smile was genuinely proud, as if she were being asked about a particularly clever accomplishment. "It was actually quite simple once we accepted that it was necessary. The royal family's business associates were very understanding about the threat Diana posed to their own interests. They provided the technical expertise needed to ensure that Diana's accident appeared completely natural." The queen consort moved to pour herself another cup of tea, apparently unbothered by the horrific nature of what she was discussing. Diana's car was equipped with a remote-controlled override system that could be activated by radio signal. When she left the charity dinner that night, she was driving exactly the route we expected her to take. A single command from a nearby vehicle caused her brakes to fail and her steering to lock at precisely the right moment to send her into the bridge support. Elena felt sick as she listened to the casual description of premeditated murder. "And Morrison was more difficult," Camilla admitted with a slight frown. "He was a professional investigator after all, and he understood the value of the evidence he had gathered. But he also had a daughter studying at university and an elderly mother in a care facility. When it was explained to him that their safety depended on his discretion, he chose to take his own life rather than risk harm coming to his family. The cold-blooded calculation behind Diana's murder was staggering, But what truly horrified Elena was the realization that Camilla felt no remorse whatsoever about any of it. In her mind, she had simply solved a problem that threatened something she valued more than human life. The beautiful irony, Camilla continued, is that Diana's death actually made her more valuable to the monarchy than she ever was while alive. Dead, she became a symbol of charitable service and royal dedication. Her memory generates more positive publicity for the crown than her living presence ever did. In a very real sense, Diana's greatest contribution to the royal family was her own martyrdom. Elena's hand moved to her service weapon, her training taking over as she realized that this conversation had gone far enough. "Your Majesty, I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, treason, and..." Camilla's laughter cut her off, a sound of genuine amusement that was more chilling than anger would have been. "Oh, my dear, you still don't understand how this works, do you? You think you can simply arrest the Queen Consort of England and march her off to jail like some common criminal?" Before Elena could respond, the drawing room doors burst open, and 6 armed men in dark tactical gear flooded into the room. Elena's hand was on her weapon, but she found herself facing multiple automatic rifles aimed directly at her chest. She recognized the lead figure as Commander Marcus Webb, the head of Royal Protection Services and technically her superior within the palace security hierarchy. "I'm sorry, Elena," Webb said, though his expression showed no remorse whatsoever. "Her Majesty explained the situation to me this morning. We can't allow you to jeopardize the security of the crown." Elena realized that the conspiracy was far broader than she had imagined. Webb and his men weren't just protecting Camilla from immediate arrest. They were part of the same criminal network that had arranged Diana's murder. The corruption extended throughout the highest levels of royal security, which explained how the conspiracy had remained hidden for so long. Commander Webb has been invaluable in maintaining the necessary relationships between the royal family and our business partners, Camilla explained with obvious satisfaction. He understood from the beginning that sometimes protecting the crown requires making difficult decisions about individual threats. Elena's mind raced as she tried to calculate her options. She was outnumbered and outgunned, but she still had one advantage that Camilla didn't know about. The cloud backup of all the evidence she had gathered was set to automatically release to multiple journalists and government officials if she didn't check in within the next 6 hours. Diana's revenge would be accomplished whether Elena survived or not. "You can kill me," Elena said, surprised by the calmness in her own voice. "But the truth about Diana's murder is going to come out regardless. I've made sure of that." Camilla's confident expression faltered for the first time. "What do you mean?" Elena smiled, feeling a moment of satisfaction at the uncertainty she could see in her enemy's eyes. "I mean that I've documented everything I've learned, including this conversation. If I don't prevent it within the next few hours, that information will be automatically released to journalists, members of parliament, and international law enforcement agencies. Diana's evidence, Morrison's files, and your confession will all become public knowledge." The Queen Consort's face went pale as she realized the implications of what Elena was saying. "You're bluffing. I'm a military-trained security professional who discovered evidence of regicide," Elena replied evenly. "Did you really think I wouldn't have a contingency plan?" Webb looked uncertainly between Elena and Camilla, clearly waiting for orders but unsure how to proceed. The revelation that Elena had prepared for this possibility had obviously not been part of their plan. Camilla's political instincts took over as she began to calculate damage control options. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. "I want justice for Diana," Elena said firmly. "I want the truth about her murder to become public knowledge, and I want everyone involved in the conspiracy to face the consequences of their actions. Most importantly, I want the royal family to be freed from the criminal influences that have corrupted the crown."
"That's impossible!" Camilla snapped.
"Even if we were to confess to Diana's death, the resulting scandal would destroy the monarchy entirely. William Jr. and Prince Henry would lose everything, and the institution itself would collapse." Elena had anticipated this argument, and she had an answer ready. The monarchy survived Edward VIII's abdication. It survived the crisis of Charles I's execution, and it can survive this. But only if the current generation of royals has the courage to choose honor over criminal profit. For the first time since Elena had entered the drawing room, Camilla looked genuinely uncertain. The queen consort was clearly calculating whether it might be possible to contain the damage from a partial confession while maintaining some version of royal authority. If the criminal connections were severed, Elena continued, and if Diana's murder were acknowledged as the work of rogue elements within the royal household, it might be possible to frame this as a successful reform effort rather than a complete scandal. William Jr. could take the throne as a reformer who cleaned up his father's mistakes. Elena could see Camilla's mind working as she considered this possibility. The alternative, complete exposure of the royal family's criminal connections, would indeed destroy the monarchy entirely. A controlled confession that blamed Diana's death on unauthorized activities by trusted advisors might allow some version of the royal family to survive. The silence stretched for long minutes as Camilla weighed her options. Outside the drawing room windows, Elena could see members of the public beginning to gather for the Diana memorial ceremonies, unaware that they were about to witness the most dramatic moment in royal history since the English Civil War. Finally, Camilla spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. If I were to consider such an arrangement, what assurances could you provide that the worst of the evidence would remain sealed? Elena felt a surge of triumph as she realized that Diana's ghost was finally going to get her revenge. The same assurance Diana tried to give you 10 years ago, that the truth, properly handled, can be less damaging than continued deception. But this time, the choice isn't going to be made by people who profit from corruption. As thunder crashed overhead and rain began to fall once again on Ravenswood Palace, Elena prepared to negotiate the terms of a justice that had been 10 years in the making. Queen Diana Rosewood would finally have her revenge, and the royal crown would finally be freed from the criminal conspiracy that had infected it for decades. The ghost of the People's Princess was ready to rest in peace, but only after the truth had set both her memory and her children's inheritance free from the corruption that had cost her life. Justice, Elena realized, was sometimes worth waiting for, especially when it came with the power to transform an entire nation's future. The end.